Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight to this community-wide forum, which is being telecast for those folks who couldn't make it. But I wanted to start off tonight by just thanking you for coming. My name's Elsie Nunn from Project Learn, and we're happy to co-host this event with the Mass Association for School Committees and Glenn Kuchar, the city, the Nellie May Foundation, and of course the mayor's office and the Lowell Public Schools. So with that, I'm going to kick it off and introduce the mayor.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming to tonight's Project Learn event of a community forum on selecting a new superintendent. Before I say a few words, I'd like to introduce Vice Mayor Vesta Noon is here. Okay, also School Committee Person Robert Hoey, and School Committee Person Jackie Doherty. Okay, the one thing I have to say as mayor, I found out I need roller skates because I have several other events to go to tonight that I had previous commitments made. But it's important for me to be here tonight to introduce this program. I also want to thank Tom Zupa and the committee tonight, the people who have agreed to speak on the matter of selecting a new superintendent, because with their help, we're going to be able to think about what's the best way to do this. The Lowell school system is a great school system. Why? I was former headmaster of the high school. I worked with the children. We had the best children in the state, no question about that. But the thing is, in a system, we want to make sure that we choose someone who fits the needs of the Lowell school system. And that's not an easy thing to do. But with the help of this forum tonight, I think you'll get some ideas of what we should be looking at in selecting a new superintendent. But I'd also like to ask Tom and the panelists to think about something else. What should a superintendent expect from the Lowell School Committee? I think that's important. I think when we talk about attracting the best that we have, we know in Lowell we have great students. We know we have a community college. We have a university that's second to none. We also have an LZ Nunn and Project Learn, a public-private partnership that is the envy of many, many communities. And it's unusual for a community such as Lowell to have these type of resources. We have it all. So that would allow us to select the best that's out there. But there's one more ingredient. With the Ed Reform Bill and what happened with Ed Reform, the role of the school committee has changed. And I'd like to have this panel also discuss the behavior of the school committee in attracting the best qualified candidate to become Superintendent Lowell. In other words, what should be our role in ensuring that we work well with the new superintendent, no matter who he, she is, and that we service our students and our parents and the taxpayers. That's what it's all about, but it's doing it the right way. So I want to thank LZ for sponsoring this. I want to thank the panelists for coming here, and I want to thank the Lowell Sun, which is an important cog in making sure that people become aware of what's going on. Tom Zupa for shepherding this panel tonight. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mayor. And So we all know that to have a great school system, you need an engaged community of parents and advocates. And your presence here tonight really shows how much this community cares about making sure that every student, not just a few, not just at some schools, but has the access she or he needs to succeed and thrive. So because when our children succeed, our community is a more vibrant, enriched, and equitable place for our families. And so that's why we're here. And this is a really pivotal time for our schools, as the mayor really alluded to. We know that the next superintendent of the Lowell Public Schools can be a critical lever to advance change and innovation where needed, and just as importantly, promote the inspiring work that's already happening in our schools. So I'm really grateful to have a really outstanding panel here tonight who are going to really sort of give us some insights, and they're all committed to education here in our state and seeing what Lowell can do, because we know we can always do more for our kids. And first to my right, Cheryl Camacho. Cheryl is the special assistant to Commissioner Riley, and I think she's also an EDD candidate at Harvard School of EDLD at the Harvard School of Education. So she brings perspective as a former principal at an urban district in Champaign, Illinois, and she's a former teacher and coach in Atlanta. Tom Scott is the executive director of the Mass Association for School Superintendents, and also has a lot of experience running leadership programs for superintendents and school leaders and others. Colleen Dawicki is on the school committee in New Bedford Public Schools, and through her work at the Federal Reserve Bank in Boston, she's familiar with Lowell and through the Working Cities Initiative. And Ben Forman, longtime friend and friend of the Gateway Cities, and he's the research director at MassINC and recently published a report on local accountability for school districts in Massachusetts. And we're really lucky to have Tom Zupa, the senior editor at the Lowell Sun, who's going to be our moderator and will moderate the conversation. And with that, I'm going to kick it off to Tom.
Great, thank you. Thank you, LZ. Thank you, panelists, for being here, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here this evening. As you're hearing, this is a critical decision that the city is going to face. Early on in my tenure as the editor, someone identified to me about a half a dozen people in the city who are really critical to make sure the city is successful. And the school superintendent was one of those people. And it's important for two reasons, I think. First, you want that person to be someone who is an educational leader, making sure that every student gets the education they deserve, that that education is equitable, that the services are there. At the same time, making sure that you have a healthy school district sends a message to the communities, because you want to be a destination for education. You want people coming in from the outside, replenishing and revitalizing the city. So making the city attractive, a large part of that is going to be making sure your school district is attractive to people to come here. If you read the paper, you see a lot of stories all the time about achievers in the Lowell school system. There are many of them. Still, there's a lot of work to be done. So being a school superintendent today is an immensely complex job, from educational policy to day-to-day operations, and the worst decision of all, when to close school for snow. So that is the biggest no-win out there for a school superintendent, and I would suggest that the school committee ask that question moving forward. With that, I want to just throw a couple of questions out to the panel to get started. And Colleen, I wanted to direct this one to you first. My understanding is you've had a very successful school superintendent search in the last year in New Bedford. Could you explain how the school committee attacked that, and maybe what you learned from that process that we could learn from?
Certainly. So I don't speak for the whole school committee, but I've been very pleased with our choice of superintendent in Thomas Anderson, who came to New Bedford from the Randolph Public Schools. And our search went, I think, a little like yours, which is that we weren't prepared to have a search, first of all. Our superintendent resigned, and this was right before I joined the school committee. And it was decided that instead of going with an interim, we would start a process a little later than we'd like. So I think we kicked it off in January, 1 year ago, 2018, and concluded right around this time. So it was pretty tight. It was 3 months. And to some extent, we got lucky. There were good candidates out there. We were able to identify finalists, which we weren't entirely sure would happen. But I think what worked for us, first of all, on the process side, was that it was transparent and inclusive. Our previous search, when I wasn't on the school committee, was perceived by a lot of folks in our community to not be inclusive, to not be transparent, and that really affected the ability of the previous superintendent to even do the job, because people didn't trust in the process through which she was selected, and she wasn't able to start off sort of giving with credibility. So I think that was really important for us, is to set out a process that we were clear about all the steps. We made lots of points of entry for community members. Much like you're doing, we had a selection committee that operated outside the school committee to look at finalists. We had focus groups, we had surveys, so I think that was a key there. And I think the other piece is that we did a good job on the sales pitch, and a big part of that is just showing your best selves as a community and recognizing that this is a great opportunity, as the mayor said, but broadcasting that very effectively, casting a really wide net, working your networks to make sure that people are seeing Lowell as a place of opportunity and recognizing that this is an important career move, but a career move that could make or break somebody. So how do you make sure that you're showing your game face as a city, that you're really serious about supporting the right candidate, not just through the hiring, but once they're on board? So I think those were some key pieces that we brought to the table in our process.
Well, I'd like to follow up with Tom, as someone who deals with school superintendents regularly. What is the perspective of a school superintendent toward a successful job search? What are they looking for?
Well, they're looking for a number of things that that would make them want to come to a community. First, I would just identify that I think that, and thank you, Mayor, for sort of leading me into this one, but they're looking for a school committee that is, how would I describe, a high-functioning school committee, a committee that works well together, a school committee that is clear about the relationship between the superintendent and the school committee. Roles and responsibilities are clearly defined. Communication systems are clearly mapped out, so people know how communication flows from the superintendent's office to the school committee. Is not tied up with school committee business all the time. It's important that the school committee have a strong working relationship with the superintendent, but that the superintendent isn't consumed by the issues that the school committee itself is working on in its own relationship. But the real focus is how the school committee as a unit, as a whole, is establishing their relationship with the school superintendent. That relationship is critically important to a school superintendent, because what's really important for most people coming into this position is that they're there in many respects to execute the policies that the school committee lays out for them. And they don't want to be sort of dealing day to day in terms of who has that responsibility for managing those policies. They want to have a large amount of that responsibility and be held accountable for executing those policies before the committee. The committee has a responsibility to evaluate around that. They're looking for community support. They want to know that the community is really sort of supportive of education. I think great to have, Project Learn, for example. That for a superintendent is really an important thing, to have parent and community who really they can rely upon and can work with in terms of how they want to communicate out to the parents, because the parents are such a critical part of the development of these children, so they want to have that relationship. So community support and engagement with the community is really important to them. The track record of the previous superintendent. How long have superintendents been around in the district? Why did the previous superintendent leave? Those are questions they're going to want to know about. They want to know what the culture is in the environment of the community. What is the community? What are the issues that the community is dealing with? And are those issues and concerns that the community has, is it a good fit for the kinds of experiences and interests that that particular candidate might have? So I could go on, but I think that those are a good sort of summary of an environment that a person wants to walk into. They want to be successful. And the other thing I would just say about this process is that any good quality candidate, it's a two-way process. You're evaluating them, their experience, the way that they work, how they fit into your expectations for them, but in turn, any good candidate is going to do the same. They're going to evaluate you, and they want to sort of find out from you what it is that you want, whether they can deliver on that, and how that relationship will work. And I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about some of the technical things that might be done between the superintendent and the school committee to be able to establish some of those common expectations, but I'll leave it at that in terms of some of the major points.
Okay, actually, I'd like to turn to Cheryl on this. You've been an urban principal, and working with the State Department of Education now, you're dealing with a lot of urban districts and dealing with those leaders. What qualities and experiences are helpful when it comes to leading an urban district?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that comes to my mind first and foremost is just that the person can hold complexity. As we know, education has shifted a lot over the past few decades. Public education in particular is under a lot of stress, a lot of pressure, a lot of demographic shifts, funding changes, political changes. Everything swirling around school districts is just leading to more and more complexity. So I think that for any leader to be really successful in any district, but especially particularly in an urban district, they have to be able to hold the complexity and navigate through it in a way that makes the people that they're working underneath them and the community that they're working with, partners side to side, that they have confidence in that. I also think, when I think about my time as a principal in a turnaround context, so I worked in a school that served the largest percentage of children in poverty in my district, served the largest percentage of children who are minorities in my district, largest percentage of kids involved in the foster care system, largest percentage of kids who were homeless in my district. I really think that what made my relationship very successful with my superintendent in particular was her ability to differentiate the way that she was leading for different schools. So understanding that different schools have different contexts, different communities need different things, and different leaders have different strengths and weaknesses, and you need to be able to support all of them in a way that enables them to really lead and make a difference and make an impact.
And finally, I want to turn to Ben and ask about the question of accountability, not only between the school committee, the school district, and the superintendent, but within the district and perhaps with the public.
You know, I think the mayor started off alluding to this point. Accountability is something that we've traditionally, for the last 2.5 decades, looked upon the state to provide. And the state has done that with a really crude formula that looks at MCAS test results and graduation rates, and that's essentially it. And that is not a strategy. But that's what urban districts are pressured to improve on, you know, for the 23rd consecutive year running. It's really hard to engage a community in improving the same things year after year after year when their kind of statistical noise is moving those things up and down, and you never know how much progress you're really making. I think, you know, having a superintendent that can work with the community to craft a vision for what are the values and aspirations of the community writ large at the district level, but also, you know, as Cheryl pointed out, each school community within the district. You know, by law, each school and district in the state has to create a strategic plan, and they're just compliance documents. They're not real strategies. And because of that, you know, to Tom's point, when superintendents are evaluated, it's really hard to figure out, did they achieve what we wanted them to achieve over the period of this contract? And so they get evaluated on these totally subjective things, like, did they communicate well? And every school committee member does, you know, there's no yardstick for that. They vote differently, and it's really hard to have coherence that way. So I think, you know, working with the superintendent to demonstrate that what you want is a vision that's unique to Lowell. You want to be part of crafting that vision as a team, and you want to prioritize. You don't want to have a million different things, but you want to say for the next 3 years, this is what we want to tackle. We want to put it down. We want it to be measurable, and we want to know how to do our part, whether it's a school committee through a school site council and the PTO, or whether at the larger community level, it's the great colleges and universities you have, or the health centers that you have, or the early education providers you have, or the cultural institutions. Whoever is woven into that bigger framework that really is about what the future of learning is in Lowell and how you create an exceptional learning environment together.
Anybody else?
Could I tack on?
Sure, go ahead.
So along those lines, I think one step you all can be taking now, and you already are, is to figure out what some of those priorities are through your focus groups, if you do a survey, recognizing that your community already holds in its mind a narrative about where you want to go, and being clear about what that is so you can broadcast that to candidates is important. That's something that we didn't have time to do in our process, and it was frustrating because we got to the point of making a decision, and we were making a decision based on, as Ben said, sort of this subjective viewpoint that we all held about what it looks like to be successful. So I think if there's an opportunity for your community to take all the information you're gathering now and identify these are our priorities for who we need to hire, and then use that to build on as you craft a vision together. That's a really great opportunity that I wish we hadn't missed.
I'll speak to a couple of issues. Ben sort of reminds me a little bit. One of the things we do in our organization when we bring in new superintendents is we spend a considerable amount of time with them sort of developing a strategy for how they enter into a community and how they learn from that community and how they sort of define what the real issues are and how they go about executing a plan to make the improvements that the community is looking for. So one of the things we do is we strongly recommend to new superintendents going into a community that you spend enough time to listen and not talk. Listen to the community. There are a number of stakeholders in that community. They exist amongst students, teachers, union, leadership team, school committee, parents, community officials. All of them have a perspective. And what you need to do is you need to learn from them what they see are the primary concerns and issues. And what we need to understand is that superintendents can't solve all the problems. And what we suggest to them is they really focus on what are the 2 or 3 or 4 major problems you have in that community. And once you develop those, you put together an entry plan. And you go before the school committee to the community, and you tell them what you've learned. And once you've learned that, and you get that feedback once again, you pretty much have at least a template for you to go out and work with the key stakeholders, your leadership team, teachers and union, parents, kids, school committee, and put together a set of strategic objectives around those 3 or 4 items, and then ultimately a set of strategic objectives. What are the initiatives? What can you provide to the community in terms of what will actually be the steps we're going to take towards improving in those areas you've identified? And how do we be held accountable for seeing that those things are done? So we work a lot with them in terms of developing that. And so one of the things that most superintendents will do today, because it's also a requirement on the part of the state to make sure that they provide improvement plans, state, district, and local building plans, is to have a strategy for how you do that. So that's important.
And if I could just add on to that, I love everything that's been said around raising priorities, because as somebody who's worked in urban districts for my entire career of 18 years in education, one of the most frustrating things, I think, for principals and teachers, and also central office administration and superintendents, is the overabundance of initiatives that bump into each other and don't make sense and don't go together. So I think really getting together with your community and being very clear on what your priorities are. Strategy is as much about what you're going to do as it is about what you're going to stop doing. And so I think when you're interviewing people, talking to them, engaging their mindset around that and their beliefs around that is really important.
So part of this evening is going to be devoted to hearing what you in the audience have to say as well. We have microphones set up here on my right, your left. If you have a question or a comment, step up. Otherwise, we're just going to have a discussion here. So I see someone headed toward the, I'm asking is Councilor Noon. Councilor Noon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Super. Mayor, you're leaving now? No. Thank you. Thank you very much for this forum. Is great. Lieutenant for organizers and all of you for participating in this. The mayor touched on something very, very important. That is, the school committee need to listen to the superintendent as well as to the parent and the community as well. First question actually to Tom. Given the fact that the last 10 years, Lowell school system have had, I would say, 4 or 5 superintendents. How would you classify that school committee culture? Should anyone ever dare to apply for the job here?
I was trying to be tactful earlier in identifying
I tried to be direct.
the important role. I'm well aware of the turnover of superintendents in your community, and it's a problem. And I can't lay it all on the feet of the school committee, but the school committee plays a critical role. So what I would say is that you would be well advised to spend some time, particularly the committee itself, to talk about where have we gone wrong. Maybe it was in the selection of the people. Maybe it wasn't the committee itself. Maybe it was the committee itself. But if you made the decisions, why did you make the decisions that you did? And I think one of the things I think is important is the time be spent talking about, before we look forward to what we need, what did we have or what were we looking for we didn't get? And where were our missteps in terms of making those decisions? Or along the way, what did we do or not do to make sure that that superintendent was successful? And so I have a couple of suggestions that I think would be helpful in that regard. So in addition to, I think, doing this advanced work before you actually get into the search process, I think you've been doing that. From what I understand from Glenn, you've had 25 or 26 different focus groups. That's an amazing commitment, and you've got large numbers of people who've come out. So that's clearly an indication this community is being very serious about this process. So what have we learned from that? And hopefully that's a template for what we're looking for in the way of a new superintendent. Once you figure that out, and you can be very clear with whatever committees are going to be doing the interview process, you should have a lens that the school committee and the community have for what you're looking for. When you hire someone, I think what's equally important is that you invest the time to build the relationship with that superintendent. Part of that, I believe, working with other urban superintendents who've done this, is to make sure that there is a common set of norms that the committee and the superintendent agree to. Bring in some consultants to work with you on that issue, but come up with some common set of norms and have the school committee and the superintendent regularly review those norms, and are we being successful with each other to make sure our lines of communication are clear. Just as one example of something I think which would be beneficial in terms of building that relationship. There are other things we could suggest.
Thank you, Tom. I do, if I may ask one more question. Sure. This question is to Colleen. You a school committee in New Bedford. What is the makeup of a New Bedford ethnic population?
So our student population is about 40% Hispanic or Latino. And we are not representative on the school committee of our population, so that's an issue I know that you've talked about in Lowell. And if I can tack on actually to what Tom was saying, so to your question about the turnover, you're not unique, and New Bedford is in a similar position. And if you look into the circumstances of our previous superintendent's resignation, it points to school committee being part of the problem. And so I think one thing is, first of all, that we were able to overcome some dramatic issues that happened with the rest of the school committee really presenting a professional, organized front. I actually talked to Tom about this because my concern was, we all Google each other. You're going to learn anything you need to know about a community by reading about some school committee meetings. And I was concerned that, are we actually showing an image of a place where you could be successful in this position? So I think that there is, even just being open to the idea that you have to reflect inward, it's not just about the superintendent candidate is important. And the other thing that I saw happening in New Bedford, at least, is some overcorrection when a superintendent didn't work out. So probably more than a decade ago, we had a candidate who came from outside the state. It didn't work out. It was attributed to outsider status. So we went with an insider. The insider didn't work out because there wasn't a perception of rigor, so we went with someone who was super rigorous. So I think that idea that you don't need to just take the problem of the day and oversolve it. You really need to stay at a higher level about what are your priorities, what's the leader you aspire to have. Don't just solve for the previous leader.
Did you have a blue ribbon committee, and what's that blue ribbon committee look like? Is that inclusive and trusted kind of process? Because Lowell have a blue ribbon committee, and I don't know if you know, but you could learn from Alice Nunn and other. So is that blue ribbon committee, if you do have one, is that inclusive and trusted process so that the rest of the community can say, vouch to this is the right process. That's all my question. Thank you.
Actually, I'd like to follow up on this. Colleen, you mentioned the school committee doesn't necessarily look like the student population. How important is that? But also, just for the panel, how important is it that the staff reflect the student population?
Can I jump in on this? You know, because this is something our study looked at. In gateway cities, you know, there's about 25 of them in Massachusetts. The ones we looked at, about 10% of their school committee members are people of color. About 75% of their students are students of color. So there's a huge imbalance. And after looking at the research of what that imbalance means, I came to the conclusion that a school committee that looks like your student population is not a nice-to-have thing, it's a must-have thing. Because clearly, the more leadership of color you have on the governing body, the more staff you have of color in the schools, and the more staff you have of color in the schools, the better your students of color do. So I think there's got to be more urgency than there is right now to address that problem, which is systemic across the state. I think if we had school councils that were empowered and functioned and built parent leaders and increased their governing skill, that would create a pipeline to move up into the school committee structures. But I don't know that we have time to wait. I think there's more urgency, and I think we ought to pursue other solutions, like potentially having the city appoint some members to the community to increase the diversity of the overall body. And I'm sure there's, I know there's lots of debates about how we get there. I don't know what the best course is, but I do know that it is something we need to talk about and address.
Yeah, and I can just say, so we did have a selection committee. We didn't use the term blue ribbon, but it was a selection committee that was intentionally representative and inclusive, recognizing if our school committee doesn't reflect all of the views and backgrounds, then our selection committee really needs to. And I think it's important to see that as a leadership development pipeline, just as Ben recommended seeing school councils that way, because if you bring more people into the process and demystify what it's like to be on a school committee, you're more likely to get those people to pursue office. So I think it's important, too, to be intentional around how you develop and engage new leaders.
Tom and Cheryl?
Yeah, so Tom knows I have some thoughts on this. So I'm leading a project in the department called Influence 100, which is about this very challenge, because in Massachusetts, only 4% of traditional public school superintendents are of color. And this is in a state where 40% of our students who are being served by the schools are of color. And so there is a challenge there. And we are working on that in the department. We have a lot of really important partners, such as Tom and Glenn Kuchar from the Massachusetts Association of School Committees, who really care about this challenge as well. But I think what strikes me most as I think about it is just the things that we've isolated that are problematic sometimes in searches when candidates of color apply for superintendent positions. And the first is that, professional networks are very racially and ethnically isolated. Oftentimes when senior leaders apply for roles, they reach out to their networks, or they find out about roles through their networks. And if you have isolated networks, then you're lacking a whole group of people that could potentially be really powerful leaders in your community. Another one is bias throughout all stages of the hiring process. So all the way from how you screen applicants, to the questions you ask, to the qualifications you think are most important. I think it would be very beneficial for you all as a community to have a conversation, and I know that you're doing it because you have all these community forums, around what are the actual qualities that a superintendent needs in this community at this time, right? Because the superintendent that's needed in this community at this time may be different from the superintendent that was needed 10 years ago, right? And so I think that's important. And the last is also an avoidance of focusing explicitly on race when we think about searches such as these. So if you think that it's important to deeply consider a robust pool of candidates of color, it's important that those conversations are happening so that when you start to bring them together and you start to interview them and engage them in a process, people actually have a chance to potentially get that role in your community.
I concur with all of that. I do think that we've got to look at some of the statewide policies as well in terms of how we do a better job of attracting candidates of color. I know that one thing we do with our new superintendent induction program, we have a strand on bias and equity. And part of what I think you need to do as a community, any urban community, you have a lot of diversity. That diversity needs to be embraced and supported, and there needs to be someone who really understands, sort of in a cultural sense, how to deal with those populations and that diversity. And so it's a really critical thing. I think as far as the state is concerned, the state, thankfully, Cheryl being one example of what this commissioner has identified, this commissioner has made this issue a priority. And so I really do believe that over the course of the next several years, more focus and attention will be taking place around how we do a better job of recruiting, developing, supporting candidates. And it's got to come from the teacher to the building to the central office. It's got to be right through the system that we're going to have to be attentive to this issue.
Thank you. Sir, thank you for your patience. Your question?
I'm Jonathan Richmond. I'm the founder, together with a group of fellow MIT alumni, of a program to encourage very talented disadvantaged kids to go to college, and we've been active in Lowell. And I'm very glad to say I want to follow on from the conversation that has just taken place. It has raised some very important questions. I'll tell you my two questions first and then make a couple of comments. The first question is, how do we ensure that we hire a superintendent who understands the nature of disadvantaged and takes it into account in all of her or his actions? Because we haven't done that up until now. And the second question is, how can we possibly do it in the short time frame that we have for finding a superintendent, and shouldn't we go for another interim for a year? I mean, Janine Durkin has been absolutely terrific, and I'm sorry she's not staying on. She was fantastic. And I think we should possibly, I want to ask you if you think we should get another interim in order to allow a full year to get the right person. Now, the issue of disadvantage is clear to me. It hasn't been recognized in this community. It hasn't been properly understood, and that has caused a lot of problems. I understand Lowell High School has been classified as a level 4 underperforming school, but it's not because of any problems with the teachers or the other staff. They're terrific. I've been working with a number of them recently on one kid. And you have teachers who are not just fantastic, but go completely beyond. They're working after normal school day, they're helping kids. I mean, they're fantastic. And we're having counselors who are giving good advice, but still we're having kids who are underperforming. And the reason is, and some people have suggested it's a problem with the school buildings. That's not the case. The problem is that disadvantage has not been addressed. Just to give you one example, because I don't want to take too long, there's one kid I've been helping. He's been given a lot of fantastic advice by his counselor, and then he doesn't follow it through because the home environment is chaotic. And so it takes understanding the lack of parenting and substituting for it to go ahead. So my first question is, this community has some fantastic teachers, some wonderful counselors, but I believe it is underperforming because it has never recognized disadvantage which exists in the families of the majority of the kids in the Lowell school system. How would you ensure that a superintendent is hired who is sympathetic to that and who is going to act on that? And the second thing is, can we possibly do that in the short time that has been designated? And should we instead have another interim and do the job properly? Thank you very much.
Cheryl, I'm going to start with you and come down this way for a change.
Great. So I'm actually going to take the first question around disadvantage, and I actually want to push back a little bit on that term and on the framing, because I think that part of the challenge for me as someone who's been working in urban education in Atlanta, Chicago, like all over the place, is that we often view children who grew up in poverty or children who come from homes that are different from the ones that we think of typical white middle-class families as disadvantaged when they actually come with incredible strength and incredible resilience. And their families come with incredible strength and incredible resilience. So I think what's important is for you to find somebody to lead your system who actually believes that. I think that's important. And I also think that it's important that the community can find a way to somewhat align on how you're framing your community. I don't view Lowell as disadvantaged. I don't view poverty as, I think poverty is a painful thing, but I think that kids who grew up in poverty aren't necessarily doomed to like a horrible existence or a horrible life. And I've worked with teachers and I've led teachers who've actually been very, very good at intervening in kids and helping provide the supports they need by viewing them through an asset-based lens. And so I think that's kind of how I'm thinking about the first part of your question.
Anyone else?
I would say what the superintendent says matters. I think expectations are a big part of what you need to expect from any leader, whether that's the superintendent, who I think has a major bully pulpit voice in terms of how he or she sort of defines what I expect and what this district expects from our kids. I agree that I don't think disadvantage is the be-all and end-all, because I think there are a lot of kids who come from disadvantaged environments who do very well. I think what's important is that the system as a whole embrace an expectation, and I think that voice does come from the superintendent. I would also say that I think one of the things that I think the superintendent needs to think seriously about, and I hear this across the state, I hear this is probably one of the biggest issues that superintendents talk about today, is how the demographics of our communities are changing dramatically. And so it's not simply a matter of number of children in poverty. It's not simply a matter of number of kids who are ELs or a number of kids who come with some disadvantage. But it's also the resources that the superintendent has to provide infrastructure supports for kids. And so you do need the ability to sort of identify where do we put whatever those resources, limited resources we have that can most benefit, how do we help to prop up and support the family, the student, the teacher who's delivering to those children? How do we kind of create the best environment we can with the resources we have? Because in today's environment, we do have a lot of challenges that we need to recognize and face up to, but we don't let those get in the way of how we create an environment that allows kids to be as successful as they can possibly be.
You know, it's funny because when you first used the term disadvantage, I had the same thoughts that Cheryl's raised, but I also think it's important not to paper over the very real problems that are out there. I mean, there are hundreds of children who are living with parents who are addicted to opiates, and I think it's really incumbent on the community to look at that problem and figure out, are we getting every one of those kids the services they need and the support they need to address the trauma related to that, and make sure they're eating and support it as much as you can as a community. I think you want a superintendent who's going to do that. At the same time, those kids have very real strengths that we want to develop. You know, their linguistic abilities, I think, really stand out. I mean, the fact that we only really evaluate acquisition of English, we don't really look at the growth of the children's native language. It's crazy. And I think an inclusive urban community should think about that. And then, you know, just lastly, the language around level 4 schools and underperforming. I think you make a really good point that there's unbelievable work that's not being honored by a formula that ranks apples to oranges. You cannot compare with the same set of numbers what's happening in an urban school to what's happening in the other districts around the state. And it's really unfair to urban educators. It's unfair to inclusive communities that open their doors to the world. And I know we've been trying to make this argument for a long time, and I think the state really owes it to our gateway cities to take a better approach than what we've used for the last decade or two. Thank you.
You want to add to that, Colleen? Or?
I think just I'll add very briefly that we've talked a lot about messaging and framing, and I think everyone has stated what that means and what the implications are very well. So to me, it would be a matter of how do your candidates message and frame the opportunity that is coming to Lowell and being a leader in this district. And I think listening for how candidates address issues of whether you call it disadvantage or lack of opportunity, inclusion, whatever words that a candidate uses is going to tell you a lot about their mental model and how to approach an opportunity in Lowell. So I think being clear as you have your focus groups and surveys, what are you looking for? How are you looking for someone to frame that? How does it align with the narrative you want to carry for your city? And then how do you hear that expressed back to you?
I just want to add one thing. I think this is something that's actually starting to take root in communities. I'm aware of at least one job posting out there for a school department director of equity, which is a person who's going to be looking at all of these things across all disciplines to make sure the programs are stable and serving all of the students equally. I just want to get the other piece of your question, which was the quick turnaround. Colleen, you did a very quick turnaround in New Bedford. How fraught was that?
Yeah, so my bias and instinct would have been to have an interim. So the process started actually before I took my seat. However, the horse left the barn, and we made the best of the process that we could, recognizing that we wouldn't select the best we got if it wasn't the best for our kids. So I think the fact that you've got a process underway, how do you extract the most value out of the investment of time people have made and the effort you've got to have this search process underway, but keeping in mind that there is a graceful approach to say, this isn't where we want to be, maybe giving yourself, if that's the case, the time to have a conversation about values and priorities. But right now you're in it, and I think, how do you make the best of being in it in this moment?
Okay, thank you. And just thank you for the comment on opioids. It's not only opioids in Lowell. There's a lot of trauma here. There are a lot of wonderful people who are unfortunately not able to do proper parenting. And kids are unfortunately kids. They're not adults. They need help. They need direction. So whether or not they might potentially have strengths, and the whole point is that they do have potentially great strengths. A lot of those strengths are not realized right now because the nature of that disadvantage, the nature of problems with parenting is not recognized by the school district or the superintendent. So that's why I feel it should be accounted for. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You have another question? And/or comment, Mr. Hoey?
Hi, how are you? Thank you. I don't want to take up too much time here, but I think it's important for me to say I've never been really happy with the way they approach hiring a new superintendent. I didn't like the last search they had, MASC, but now I'm feeling very optimistic. Normally I'm a pessimist. I know that. Most people think, even my wife thinks I'm a pessimist. But having Mr. Kuchar in charge right now, actually from the MASC, kind of turns me on. I know the guy's going to attract someone great for us, so I'm all for that outfit to go help us do this search. But I was elected to the school committee in 1995, the first time. And I have to say, back then it was early in ed reform, and we had a ton of money. We had wheelbarrows full of money. I could do anything. A movie studio. We could buy anything we wanted. But after coming back now, I've been on 2 school committees recently, and I think it's one of our biggest issues, especially in Lowell. We have an HR director problem. We've had that for a good 15 years. And the superintendent has problems all the time because under ed reform, it's up to him who he picks for the high school leader. It's up to him who he picks for a principal. And sometimes when you got 3,000 pensions sitting around a system as big as Lowell's, everybody wants in charge of that thing. Everybody wants to get their friend a job. It's one of the biggest things I've faced since I've been back. Can you get me a job? I always say no. I can get you an interview. And I made sure, like, for an example, anybody from Lowell, you're going to get a final interview. Because most people feel we should be hiring more custodians from Lowell. I'm just going down at that level. But it's all about jobs. We seem to have a real problem. And in Lowell, let me tell you something. This is how I feel. Our student body is, I'm going to say, 30% Latino, 29% Southeast Asian, 29% white. Maybe have 8% black, and most of the blacks that we have come from other countries. Our student body, we might be the 4th largest system in the state. We're the best when it comes to diversity already, and we're working on more of it. I know just on the school committee alone, I said last year to Dominic Lay, he's the first Asian American elected as a school committee person. I said, Dominic, put your name on the ballot and say you're for downtown. And because we had an issue here, Collie or downtown, where our high school is going to be built. So he did what I said, and he won. So I was out working that way. You have Vesna Noon already on the city council. I think we have a problem getting Latinos elected. I mean, I grew up out of a housing project, oldest of 13 kids. I dropped out of high school, and I got one of 6 votes on a $181 million budget. So to me, Lowell's a great place. Do we have issues right now? Yes. The biggest issue is I thought we just lost a great superintendent. I'm someone that's had, I have a record to show that when I left in '97, my last motion was to give George Sapasavis a 3-year contract extension. And I was going to go run for city council. My motion passed. He got a 3-year deal. He ended up doing 12 years as a superintendent. And the last one we just lost, I think he done more for morale for teachers than anybody I've ever seen. His name was Salah Kafawi. Now, he had issues and he got fired. That's history to me. He's history. I still miss him and I like the guy. But I want to say this. I think Lowell will come out on top. We always do. I never agree with Jonathan Richmond that just spoke on the mic, but I did agree on one thing when he talked about our staff. I just visited 25 schools out of the 29 schools that we have, just so you know the exact number. And to me, our staff is second to none. And this goes out to Mr. Kuchar. I believe we have 8 to 10 people inside our staff that are qualified to be a superintendent. And some of them are going to be a superintendent very soon, all across the state. So I have an issue about it. I know we have to protect people that don't live in Lowell. We don't want to leak their name out, because we don't want them in trouble with their boss. But I have the same issue with people that work for us in the system. They're afraid to come out. I know one young lady that's running I can't say names, I've been taught this in the past year, but she came out. If she came out, she probably would get the job. But people will say to me, she's too young. I don't like hearing that. I don't like hearing she's too young. It's almost like saying someone's too old. Is she qualified? And we have them qualified, but they don't want to come out because they're not close enough to their 80%. Those pension numbers. I have a pension, by the way, only 60% though. But to me, we have to look at who we have internally also and maybe have safeguards for them that come out of their nice, cushy little school that they're running so good for us because we want you for superintendent. If you can't get along with us because we've already got a proven track record, it's not easy to get along with the school committee, that we'll have a safety net for those people. Come out, try to be the superintendent because you're very qualified. If you do good after the first year and you want to stay, fine. If you don't like us and we don't like you after the first year, we'll send you back to that school that you came from. I just don't want to lose out on our candidates from within our system. And I'm not talking to you people. I'm glad you came here today. Thank you so much. I'm actually talking to Mr. Kuchar right now because I know he'll keep that in his mind. No, I feel real good about him, and I wish I heard more from him tonight. Nothing against you all. But I think we're looking for a superintendent, and right now he's the most important person in this room, and I wanted to hear from him again tonight. But thank you. Thanks for your time. Appreciate everything. Thank you very much.
Actually, I'd like to just jump on what Mr. Hoey said. What do you see as far as attracting internal candidates? How successful, how fraught is that whole process? Because politically it can be difficult as well.
I think breaking into an urban environment, being going from the outside, is really tough. I'll just say it right up front. If I meet monthly with the urban superintendents, and I've been in this job for 15 years. Glenn has been in this position more than that, and I think we have to be honest about the fact that in today's environment, it's tough breaking in as being an outsider to virtually any district. It's tougher becoming into an urban environment, and so I guess my message is that I think people need to provide people the support and give them the time that they need to acclimate and get adjusted and to get to be known within that community. School and district culture is really an important thing. When superintendents come into a job, they need to evaluate whether the environment, the culture, or the way people work, what that looks like, and if they want to change it, they have to be really tactful about how they go about making change. And coming into a big environment, a bigger environment, can be tougher for them to do. So I guess the thing I would say is that Thomas Anderson is an example coming in from the outside. Thomas is, from all accounts, is doing very well, and I can identify a number of outside superintendents who've done very well. I can also identify a lot of people who've walked in who have had a really hard time being accepted. So I think that's part of the question that I think the community needs to sort of figure out and resolve for itself, is if you're going to bring some candidate from outside, are you going to give them some time and some support to let them be successful? Because it's not going to happen immediately, and they're going to have to be given a lot of time to sort of become familiar and get to understand how the system works. So I don't know how else to answer that.
Anybody else?
I just want to share so that I have not been a superintendent, but I've been doing a lot of research on the superintendency, and I literally just read an article that talked about this very thing, that talked about when you keep somebody who's internal, the district is more likely to kind of stay as it is. It's less likely to experience like dramatic change. If you bring somebody from the outside, the district's more likely to experience dramatic change, but the tenure may be a lot shorter, right, because of the political upheaval. I mean, just thinking about it from the perspective of, I mean, I know when I taught in a school for 4 years, I'd built relationships with people there, and we had a staff member who was ascended into the principal role from the staff, and she had a really hard time challenging the status quo that had become like regular in our building, and she wasn't successful for that reason. So I think there's like two sides to every coin, and I really agree with Tom that it's really important for you all as a community to think about what does Lowell need right now. Do you need dramatic change? Do you need not dramatic change? What do you need? And I think then think about whether internal or external is maybe where you're leaning towards.
Can I just, just one other piece of that. I firmly believe that the superintendency has become far too politicized. And that's part of the reason I think we see so much turnover in the superintendency. And I think there's a good reason for that. I think that the environment that we're in today is completely different. I mean, social media doesn't contribute to a successful superintendency because everybody's out there with every decision. You mentioned snow. I mean, that's only the tip of the iceberg, right? So, but there are all these things that every decision that's made, you've got this debate going on behind them, around them, in terms of whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing. And then you get a group of 3 or 4 who becomes a group of 6 or 7 and becomes a group of 12 or 20 who don't like it. So now we're gonna make enough noise to get a change. If we allow that to happen every time there's a disagreement, you're never going to have someone who's going to have any longevity. And as long as you don't have longevity, it's really hard to have change. And the other part about that is the change. Everybody wants change until we change. Right? I mean, we all know what we want to do and we want to change it, but we're going to disrupt. And when we disrupt, we are working against somebody's stability or a way of feeling a sense of satisfaction or security. Once we start that change, then we have a problem. And so that's one of the things that as you talk about change, you're really looking for it. You want to bring a change agent in over time, you're really going to have to think a little bit about how you as a community support the change and how strategic you work with that school superintendent to make sure that change can be successful. Because it won't go smoothly, it will have its rough points, but what happens when that occurs?
So let me ask perhaps a little bit of a loaded question here. Is the model for running a school district broken? Because it seems like there are so many things, so many pieces and facets to running a school department where you have to be making sort of macro decisions and then there's the micro decisions, and you have to be a little bit of a budget expert and a lot of a curriculum expert, and you need to know building maintenance, you need to know sort of 100 different pieces. Is that model maybe getting obsolete? Because now we're starting to see some school districts where they're having somebody from the business side be the person who runs things and tends to let the curriculum go to a specialist. Is this an emerging model or is there something else going on?
I don't think it's an emerging model. We've got examples of people who've come out of military or have come out of business who've become school superintendents. And because the school, the public environment is so radically different than business or military that it's sometimes hard for them to adjust to the model. So I don't think that that's the answer. I happen to believe that I say it all the time that there are 3 critical pieces to being a successful superintendent: relationships, relationships, relationships. If you got it, you're likely to be successful. If you know how to work with people, how you work with your school committee, how do you work with your teachers in your union, how do you develop your leadership team, those are the 3 key stakeholders that the superintendent has to work with every day, every week, every month, every year. The parents, the kids, all of that, yes. But those are the critical stakeholders that they need to be able to be successful in bringing around to their way of developing a system of change. So I think it's more, has more to do with the environment today that's more complicated than it is necessarily about, do we need to change the whole thing? And I think the other piece I would just say is that, you know, any good superintendent is going to understand that they have strengths and weaknesses, and that's something you need to find out. What's the background? Are they strong in the business? Are they strong in curriculum? Are they strong in personnel? Are they strong in terms of building and conflict management? They need to surround themselves with other people who don't have the same skill set. And that's where, you know, you have to sort of look at, do we create the system that is going to be as responsive to the issues that need to be managed.
Colleen, was this an issue on the radar of your school committee when you went through this? Did you have anyone that you might have considered non-traditional apply?
We didn't, no. And I think, so Cheryl made a good point earlier about leaders who can manage complexity. And in my day job, we talk a lot about adaptive leadership. And a lot of folks in organizations in Lowell have gotten some training on that through the Working Cities Challenge. And it's really about recognizing that an adaptive leader treats problems as relationship problems and recognizes that if you want to manage change, you have to manage the loss that people experience with change. And you have to create alliances and really leverage those relationships for the work you need to get done. So I think, I mean, you'd mentioned you've got challenges with HR. I know that you've experienced budget challenges. Those we would call technical problems. So the idea that you can have a great leader who just hires someone who's really good at making the trains run on time, hiring the right staff. So one thing that I was really prioritizing in our search is how do we find that adaptive leader who gets that they don't have to be an expert in all things, but knows how to hire the right people and empower them to do their job so that they can hold this broader vision and manage the change process that our community needed to go through.
Either Cheryl or Ben, want to add anything? Or okay.
I mean, I would just say we thought a lot about this issue because in urban districts in particular, the work is so much more complex today. You got to think about, is your early education system preparing that kid for kindergarten? Are you providing the services that the families need? What's going on in summer? Is there high quality offerings being offered? How do you build the linkages to the community colleges, the local schools, and so forth? And it's just a much bigger youth development agenda than a K through 12 school. And I think some cities are putting in place these children's cabinets to manage all of that. And so I think that trying to figure out that model of governance long term is probably more in line with the way the world works today than the systems we're using that we've inherited from a century ago.
I believe we have one more question. Do we have a question? I think this will probably be our last one, LZ.
So I wanted to ask about what you think would be important for a superintendent to have, whether it would be important for them to have experience in handling rezoning a district. That's something that our school committee brought up recently, very out of the blue to the parent community. The initial proposal had actually been one of changing it for the 2019-2020 school year. That got voted down mercifully. But it is something that's being looked at. And my question for you is, especially given the contentiousness of our school committee. I'm a new parent in the system. My son's in kindergarten, and I have to say that my first impression of our school committee in my first year involved in this district has been pretty poor in terms of transparency, in terms of professionalism. So I am very concerned about how the school committee and the superintendent will work together to make sure that our kids aren't blindsided by changes, whether that's redistricting or any other changes that a superintendent wants to bring in. How do we bring in a candidate who's going to be able to both bring about changes that are necessary, but in a way that involves listening to parents, listening to the community, to the schools, to the teachers, rather than just kind of operating by fiat, which is kind of the impression that I've gotten is how things can go around here sometimes, which is not a good way to run a school.
Who wants to take that one?
Go ahead, Tom.
It's a very controversial question.
So my understanding is the basis of what you were talking about is changing zones. Redistricting, is that what we're talking about?
Back, I think it was last month, very out of the blue, one of our school committee members put forward a motion that simply said to rezone the Lowell Public Schools from a two-zone geographic system with school choice to a three-zone system without any magnet schools, to get rid of all of the magnets and move to 3 zones versus 2. The proposal would have meant about half of the students in the district would have to switch schools. And the way it was worded as a motion for the school committee was approximately to make the change for the 2019-20 school year and then begin notifying stakeholders. And that's a very huge change that was proposed very suddenly. And it didn't pass, the motion didn't pass, but they are still, it basically got sent to committee for the 2020-2021 school year. So that's become this kind of specter that came up of half the school district might have to change schools.
Right.
And so my question is, what do we look for in a candidate who, if a major change like that does end up happening, who's going to be able to manage that with sensitivity for families and students?
First thing I would say is the superintendent doesn't run the school committee. If a school committee decides there's a certain policy they want to adopt, it's the job of the superintendent to execute the policy.
How do we look for a candidate? What qualities should we look for in a candidate to manage a major transition like that?
So let me just say that again, we go back to the beginning of this whole conversation about how a school committee and a superintendent work together. The superintendent is the chief educational officer. In most successful school districts, the school committee is looking to the superintendent to advise and recommend. So if it functions properly and the committee member or committee as a whole decide this is something they want to do, they would be advised to ask the superintendent to make a recommendation on how you want to handle this for them to debate and ultimately decide. So if you have an issue with the school committee, that's an electorate issue. And so you need to go to a broader conversation. But when it comes to the role of the school committee and the superintendent, you would be advised to ask the superintendent to come back with a recommendation. Now, in virtually every district and I've done this as a superintendent, where I had to redistrict twice, it is a very contentious issue. And so it would be ill-advised to make those decisions without having enormous community involvement and over a relatively extended period of time. So I would say that any superintendent would not want to hit that third rail, him or herself, that would want to, and this is again going back to the politicization of the job, because this is the kind of thing that you don't do that well, see you later. You're not going to be around much longer. So you need to think about the process. It goes back to the adaptive leadership question. So every decision the superintendent makes has a ripple effect. It's going to impact somebody. And so if you impact the wrong people, then that sort of comes back at you. So you need to engage the community, and you need to have them actively involved in a process, and the superintendent should be prepared to be able to provide a recommendation around that process that the school committee then deliberates and makes a final decision on how that process would work. So I don't know if that helps, but that's the role of a superintendent.
Several Lowell schools right now are in some sort of turnaround status or maybe approaching some sort of turnaround status. And what should we expect from the new superintendent in terms of experience or plans for how to turn them around?
I mean, I'll take a stab at that. So I think I spoke earlier about my experience as a turnaround principal, and I think what's really important is to understand that just because a school has certain data points, it doesn't mean that everything in the school is awful and bad and wrong. And so I really appreciated the point that the gentleman made earlier around the staff being really phenomenal and excellent. I think you have to hold that orientation, but at the same time, you have to be willing to really dig deep into what is actually happening. Because if kids aren't actively learning and growing and developing, then there is something that's mismatching. Doesn't mean that anyone has bad intent. It doesn't mean that people aren't doing a good job or doing their absolute best. It just means that something needs to shift, either at a systems level or a school level or a classroom level. So I think that's really important. But one thing that always really bothered me as someone who's always worked in turnaround context was just the framing around that somehow there's something really deficient about the kids, the families, the communities, and the staff that work in those buildings. So I would say you want a superintendent who can hold that turnaround work is really, really hard work. It's really challenging, and people give it their all. And at the same time, we have to still keep our eye on the prize and trying to make sure that children are learning and growing, and they leave, and they can read, and they can do math, and they can have choices in life. So I think you have to hold both of those things.
Another aspect of that is the cultural aspect with a lot of the multi-language children and families and other issues of cultural sensitivity if the staff isn't as diverse as the community. And I think that's part of it as well, is making sure that someone understands that they may be in a challenging situation because the staff to support the students either isn't there or isn't really understanding of the cultural challenges as well.
I really appreciate that point, and I'm thinking of several children that I had either as a teacher or a principal who were labeled as discipline problems, who are actually incredible leaders, right? It's just a matter of reframing how you're interpreting that child's behavior, through like a lens of culture or race or whatever. So I really appreciate making that point.
I think most of the candidates you will get will have either a significant amount of urban experience, or who are totally committed or who are totally committed to urban education. That typically is what happens when you see candidates applying. It's sort of the place where they have their own passion, their experience, and what they want to do. And the other thing I would just say, in addition, I think the person has to have some grounding in the issues, but it's not necessary that that person have to have all the answers. Sometimes it's a matter of making sure that person knows how to find the people to surround themselves with in their administration who can do that work. Because it's typically not the superintendent who's going to be able to do the work directly. It's the superintendent who's going to sort of work with a team to make sure that it gets done. So the ability to understand the problem, but also know how to create the team that is going to address that problem is equally important.
And with that, I think we can bring the helicopter in for a landing. So, LZ, thank you very much for the invitation to be here tonight. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you so much, Tom. And panelists, you were fabulously informative and just, I think, what we had asked for. And I just wanted to point out, on your way out the door, if you haven't picked up one of these green sheets, it's just kind of ways to get involved. You can always share what qualities you would like to see for the next superintendent. There's a little website on here. And also you can call your school committee members and let them know your thoughts. But we thank you so much for coming tonight and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks, everyone.